Well, somehow we are already at 10 volumes of the Forbidden Knowledge Iceberg. This series, at least for me, has been a deeply eye-opening journey into the rot that sits beneath the surface of our world. Your simple decision to pay attention to the things that are going on and are actively being shielded from you is huge. A lot of people just choose to stay comfortable and don't want to actually investigate whether or not we are being lied to, whether or not they need to change their opinions, or honestly, whether or not there are more enigmatic or disturbing aspects to the world that they should be paying attention to. Your hunger for the objective truth, not just some subjective position that you want to see affirmed on YouTube, is honestly very moving and has kept me in check. So again, thank you and welcome to Volume 10 of the Forbidden Knowledge Iceberg. The NSA ANT Catalog. The ANT Catalog, also sometimes referred to as the Tau Catalog, is a highly classified internal product guide produced by the Advanced Network Technology Division of the NSA. A version of the catalog written between 2008 and 2009 was published by the German news magazine Der Spiegel in December 2013 with 49 catalog pages containing pictures, diagrams, and descriptions of espionage devices and spying software. Within the NSA also exists TAO, or the Tailored Access Operations Unit. This is the NSA's elite hacking division. In situations where TAO's usual hacking methods fall short, ANT offers them specialized tools to monitor smartphones, computers, and networks. For the most part, the catalog served as an internal product ordering guide to be used only within the NSA. It listed these tools alongside their technical specifications, diagrams, and pricing, ranging from free software to $250,000 hardware kits designed to bypass firewalls, encryptors, or other security defenses. This leak emerged when all the other Snowden stuff was coming out, and at first, the release of the catalog was initially attributed to him. However, officials at the NSA did not believe that the web crawler used by Snowden actually touched the ANT catalog, and as a result, they began looking for others who might have leaked it. To this day, nobody knows exactly who it was that actually hacked into the NSA and released the product catalog. Regardless, the tools described inside of it are insane. They possess a wide range of capabilities. For instance, one powerful goal for several different pieces of technology in the catalog was to plant malicious code into a computer's BIOS, which is the foundational software stored on the motherboard, and it loads before the operating system even does. Installing an exploit at BIOS level means that even if a hard drive is completely erased or a new operating system is installed, the malware would remain untouched. It would continue to reside on the motherboard and could re-inject more spyware into what appeared to be a completely clean computer, new hard drive and all. The NSA called this kind of capability persistence, and searching for that word throughout the catalog will reveal that it sat at the core of much of their technology. One hardware option in the catalog, titled RageMaster, is a simple $30 rigged monitor cable that allowed TAO personnel to see what is displayed on a target's screen. Although we only have a single page from this catalog to go off of, it seems that a nearby receiver would need to be installed to pick up the radio signal emitted by this device, and from there it could be sent back to the NSA where everything a person did on their computer could be monitored, and they'd have no idea. There's almost no way the user would ever find this, and even if they did, would they even know it's a bug? Would they even know what they're looking at? Probably not if we're talking about the average person. For them to install this on a target, all they'd really need to do is find a way into your home or office, swap a single cable, or maybe even embed it into the exact brand of wire that they already know you use if they were to find that out in advance, and that would pretty much be it. Another device is a $40,000 active GSM base station capable of mimicking a cell tower to monitor all phone data sent and received from the devices that end up connecting to it. Another, called Cottonmouth, is a computer bugging device disguised as a normal USB plug, but which is secretly capable of sending and receiving data to and from a person's PC via radio signal without detection. Again, we are talking about serious spy-level stuff here, and the craziest part is that these tools have been actively produced and deployed by the NSA for spying, and again, this was all the way back in the late 2000s. Even crazier, one of their methods of installing this software and hardware into their targets' devices is by intercepting new computers purchased online along their shipping routes before Tau would unpack them and plant backdoors in the electronics before putting them right back on their route without skipping a beat or ever being detected. So, of course, this is some extremely scary stuff. The scariest part, in my opinion, being the fact that this catalog is now 18 years old. Imagine all of the new offensive technology that the NSA has created and is actively deploying against anyone who they believe needs to be monitored. However, not all hope is lost. There are some very simple ways that you can protect yourself from the prying eyes of individual hackers or large corporations or even entire governments themselves. Recently, Proton reached out to me for an endorsement of their Proton Unlimited plan. I've seen Proton pop up multiple times. They've actually been mentioned previously in these videos, being used by people who are trying to explicitly sort of cover up their identities, basically just ensuring their own anonymity and security. I recently have started using Proton Unlimited to make sure that my internet traffic and my activities are private, secure, and untraceable. For just $10 a month, Proton Unlimited offers encrypted email, a 10-device VPN, an encrypted password manager, 500 gigabytes of encrypted cloud storage, and an encrypted Bitcoin wallet, as well as plenty of other services. But to be clear, when I say encrypted, I don't just mean the standard encryption that, say, Google or Microsoft would use. In one of my previous videos on Epstein, we discussed how the FBI forced Apple, 4chan, Citibank, and AT&T to leak information on one single whistleblower, and each of the companies were in fact forced to fork over that information. They offer something called zero-access encryption. This means that all of the information stored under your Proton Unlimited account cannot be accessed by anyone, including Proton. They physically would be incapable of actually getting your information decrypted and sent over to them. Given all of these different products that all come under the umbrella of Proton Unlimited, it's very easy for me to endorse them, especially since all of that comes at just around $10 a month. On top of this, for right now, if you go to proton.me/fortune, it actually looks like they are offering 31% off their yearly plans, bringing down the monthly cost to just $8.99 a month. That is the price of a sandwich to secure and simplify your entire life. Thank you so much to Proton for sponsoring today's video. Now, back to the iceberg. David Berg and the Children of God. David Berg was a former Christian minister born in 1919. In the year 1968, he established the cult Children of God in Huntington Beach, California. At the time, it was known as Teens for Christ and was a hippie-era evangelical commune, which quickly amassed a number of young followers who were seeking a more radical interpretation of the Christian faith. By the early 70s, the group was renamed to the Children of God and included thousands of members across the globe. Active members lived in isolated colonies where they agreed to forsake all worldly ties with the goal of living as modern apostles. David Berg, who was known to his followers as Moses David or Father David, forced himself into seclusion in 1971 and in that time issued nearly 3,000 illustrated Mo letters detailing strange and disturbing sexual philosophies that became sacred doctrine within the cult. These letters discussed the apocalypse and end times judgment, but also centered on a philosophy called the law of love. To boil this down, David basically taught that God is love, and love is sex with essentially no limits at all. as long as it is performed in genuine affection. Yeah, I'm sure that didn't lead to any horrific consequences. Berg explicitly argued that virtually any sexual boundary was a man-made restriction that true believers should reject in favor of total liberation through Jesus. Just one of the horrifying practices that this led to was called flirty fishing, which began within the cult around the year 1974. This basically consisted of David instructing the female members, who were referred to as bait or fisherwomen, to seduce outsiders through intimacy as a form of evangelism and fundraising. These encounters were to be thought of as a form of spiritual conquest. Berg justified this in extremely explicit letters, such as one titled God's Whores, by claiming it fulfilled Christ's command to be fishers of men. The practice, unfortunately, was kind of successful and yielded hundreds of thousands of new contacts for the group, and even worse, led to the birth of what they called Jesus babies, who were conceived with non-member fathers. Apparently, according to a commonly repeated figure, something like 300 of these children were born into the movement by the year 1981. Inside of these communes, the sharing of partners became routine, and as a very obvious and predictable result, disease became a disgusting side effect. By the year 1987, the practice of flirty fishing had to be abandoned because AIDS had become such a significant problem within the group. Without getting into details here, the children who were either indoctrinated or born into the group went through horrific abuse. It didn't take long for these scandals to erupt into the public spotlight, most notably in the 1990s. At that time, police raids occurred in Argentina, Spain, Australia, France, and other locations where the communes were active. Children were removed by the hundreds into protective custody. One British custody case, which occurred between 1994 and 1995, pored over extensive evidence from the communes and ruled that the group had been responsible for wide-scale abuse, leading to lasting trauma for thousands of innocents. David Berg died in hiding in Portugal on the 1st of October 1994. But unfortunately, the story only escalated into even more grim territory in the coming years. Fast forward around 10 years later to the 7th of January 2005. Ricky Rodriguez, born with the name David Moses Zerby in 1975, was the son of David and his wife Karen, and was raised as the group's prophesized messiah and future leader. On that day, Ricky recorded a 56-minute on-tape manifesto in his apartment in Tucson, Arizona. In the tape, the 29-year-old shows a gun, a knife, duct tape, a taser, and a drill, and calmly explains his motive for the crime that he was about to commit. He describes the lifelong trauma from systematic abuse that was inflicted on him and other children under the group's law of love doctrines. He describes these crimes in horrifying detail, accusing his mother, father, and other leaders of direct involvement. He explains his profound psychological struggles and asks how anyone could have committed these horrifying abuses and still sleep at night. He then outlines a plan for retribution and justice. The next day, on the 8th of January, Rodriguez invited his former nanny, Angela M. Smith, whom he accused of abusing him all those years ago, to his apartment under the pretense of dinner. He then proceeded to stab her to death. Leaving the body in the apartment, he then drove west in his Chevy Cavalier over the border into California and specifically into the city of Blythe. There, he called his estranged wife, Alexia, to confess to the murder and explain exactly why he did what he did. And at some point around 2 a.m. on the 9th, he decided to end his own suffering. Other survivors continue to recount their horrifying childhoods and unforgivable scars. The organization continues to this very day, still under the leadership of Berg's wife, Karen Zerby. They now call themselves the Family International, and they claim that many years ago, they have since reformed into a normal religious movement, but that doesn't really seem to be exactly the case. Regardless, a substantial number of the most explicit Mo letters still continue to be heavily suppressed by the group to this day. Breatharianism. Breatharianism is the pseudoscientific belief that a person can live without eating any food, and sometimes that they can live without even drinking water. And I'm not talking about simple fasting for like a day or two. These people literally claim that they don't need to eat food or drink water, period, indefinitely. Advocates of breatharianism believe that humans can sustain themselves purely on air, sunlight, and something called prana, which they define basically as cosmic energy. The practice has killed several otherwise healthy people in a pile of tragic, documented incidents. The modern breatharian movement began in 1980 when a man named Wiley Brooks appeared on television claiming he hadn't eaten in nearly 20 years. In the broadcast, he apparently proceeded to deadlift 1,100 pounds to prove his supernatural vitality. However, judging by the fact that the deadlifting world record at the time was just 885.5 pounds, set by Don Reinhout in May 1975, I seriously doubt this guy, who is clearly not a powerlifter, surpassed it by over 200 pounds on live TV and never tried to actually claim the official record. Anyways, Brooks would eventually go on to found the Breatharian Institute of America and began charging followers $10 for lectures, $100 for day-long seminars, and $500 for intensive 5-day workshops. His central message was very simple. All food, any food, is poison. He ran this institute for a couple of years before it crumbled spectacularly in 1983, when co-founder Lavelle Leffler publicly accused Brooks of sneaking junk food into his room after everyone was asleep. She told the press that she had seen him eat an omelet and watched as he consumed food around her regularly once he thought he was safe from scrutiny. Brooks was even reportedly observed leaving a Santa Cruz 7-Eleven convenience store with a Slurpee, a hot dog, and Twinkies. He tried to talk his way out of the accusation, but by that point, the damage was already done. Of course, I know this whole thing sounds completely absurd, but as we're about to get to in a minute, there were people who actually believed this idea and suffered the consequences, so we'll get to that in a minute. It seems that Brooks then later tried to incorporate very specific kinds of food into his anti-food philosophy, specifically Diet Coke and the McDonald's double quarter pounder with cheese meal. And it had to specifically be the double quarter pounder with cheese meal. With that in mind, while researching this, I came across the official Breatharian website and found this exquisite section. I'm going to read it word for word verbatim, exactly as it appears. It is better to have some Diet Coke in your bloodstream, if possible, before starting the meditation exercise. You may drink as much as you desire of Diet Coke in the 1-liter size, include lots of ice, and at McDonald's with caffeine in the plastic bottles only. The double quarter pounder with cheese meal at McDonald's is the only other part of this diet. Try to eat at least one meal a day for 1 month, 30 days to get started. It is okay to drink from the cups when eating at McDonald's. I highly recommend that you eat at McDonald's whenever possible. All McDonald's are constructed on properties that are protected by fifth dimensional high-energy/spiritual portals. As you continue to use this meditation/diet program, you will start to feel the difference in the atmosphere when eating inside of a McDonald's and outside. It is also acceptable to combine 2 Quarter Pounders with cheeseburgers to make It is also acceptable to combine 2 Quarter Pounders with cheeseburgers to make 1 double Quarter Pounder if you can't get the double Quarter Pounder with cheese where you live. Important note: do not drink water of any kind or from any source, and most importantly, do not eat any fruits or vegetables while doing this regime. I'm not really sure how this all fits into the whole not eating thing. Also, I guess we're gonna just ignore the fact that both Coke and ice contain water. Anyways, as absurd as that whole thing is, again, it unfortunately gets very serious when the movement grew to a size where there were people who legitimately started to believe this stuff. It just kind of gets really sad at this point. Another member of the movement named Ellen Grieve, who went by the name Jasmuheen, traveled the world throughout the 1990s promoting what she called pranic nourishment. She claimed to go months without ingesting anything but an occasional cup of tea, insisting her body ran on a different kind of nourishment entirely. When journalists visited her home, though, they found her refrigerator stocked with food. Jasmuheen claimed it was all for her husband and daughter. In 1999, 60 Minutes Australia challenged Jasmuheen to prove her claims under medical supervision. Again, I know it's mind-blowing, but apparently there are people who really believe it is possible to live without eating or drinking water, and they will push themselves to the edge in order to prove this to themselves and to other people. Dr. Berez Wank, president of the Queensland branch of the Australian Medical Association, monitored Jasmuheen as she tried her hardest to go just 1 week without food or water. Of course, just 2 days into the study, she displayed symptoms of acute dehydration, stress, and high blood pressure. When Jasmuheen was confronted with this fact, she blamed polluted air from the busy road near her hotel room. As a result, the producers moved her to a mountainside retreat on the 3rd day, and of course, this didn't change anything. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. Her speech became slowed, and her pupils became dilated. She lost over 13 pounds, or 6 kilograms, in just that short period of time. By the 4th day, Dr. Wank gave a final, blunt assessment. Jasmuheen was now severely dehydrated, her pulse had doubled, and she was now facing serious risk of kidney failure. The doctor stated clearly that continuing would prove fatal. The test was stopped. I'm inclined again to just laugh these people off as fraudsters, and maybe for some of them, that's all they are. People like Wiley Brooks, of course. He was sneaking around eating food behind people's backs and was obviously profiting from the scam. But for Jasmuheen, or Ellen Grieve, I think it's at least possible that she might have genuinely believed that she did not need to eat food or drink water. If she didn't genuinely believe that she could make it an entire week, if she seriously didn't think she would embarrass herself or put herself in harm's way, then why would she have faced these journalists and submitted to the test? Regardless whether she was trying to sell more of her program or she genuinely believed it, her reckless beliefs and teachings were not without dire consequences. In the year 1999, a 53-year-old resident of Melbourne, Australia named Lonnie Marcia Roslyn Morris died while attempting the breatharian diet advocated by Jasmuheen. It happened again that very same year, according to an article by The Guardian from 1999, which describes another woman, 49-year-old Verity Lynn, whose body was found in a remote area near a tent. Quote, police believe she died from hypothermia and dehydration several days before she was discovered. A copy of Jasmuheen's best-selling Breatharian premiere, Living on Light, was among her possessions, and her diary suggests she had embarked upon the 21-day initiation program recommended in the book, beginning with a week of complete abstention from food and drink. The deaths only continued. In 2012, a Swiss woman died of starvation after attempting to survive on light as taught in Jasmuheen's writings. In 2017, a 22-year-old German citizen died on the Caribbean island of Dominica after fasting for several days, having told friends and family that he planned to live off sunlight alone. Also in 2017, a Dutch woman living in a household of Breatharian practitioners died under mysterious circumstances, with the 3 remaining members suspected of withholding adequate medical care from the malnourished woman. She was obviously confronted with the reality of these deaths multiple times, and only really seemed to respond to these by blaming the victims. She claimed that Morris wasn't coming from a place of integrity and, as a result, was never going to succeed in the practices in the first place. Apparently, she just didn't have the right motivation. She suggested that Lynn's death was more of a psycho-spiritual problem and was not a physiological one that would deny any of the claims that she made in her book. Yeah, whether she is a fraudster or is actually delusional enough to believe that these practices are real, she is 100% responsible for these deaths. Because she was promoting a practice that if anyone even came close to actually succeeding in it, they would surely die. Rex 84. Rex 84, or Readiness Exercise 1984 Bravo, was a classified federal government drill conducted in April of 1984 to test a scenario which could occur in response to the declaration of a national emergency by the president. In the exercise, it was outlined that large numbers of United States residents who had been previously identified as national security threats would be swiftly rounded up and detained in prison camps at 22 military bases operated by FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The exercise, which covered this hypothetical scenario, involved 34 different federal agencies, each working alongside the Department of Defense and the National Security Council. It began when FEMA official John Brinkerhoff drafted a memo outlining the measures that should be taken in response to the outbreak of a Third World War or some other incident which causes massive public unrest. The details of this memo were revealed in the July 5, 1987 issue of the Miami Herald after a source provided them a copy of it. This memo appears to have been the starting point for a much larger plan, which the Miami Herald was the first to investigate and report on. The following are several quotations from that article, which was groundbreaking at the time. The martial law portions of the plan were outlined in a June 30th, 1982 memo by the Deputy for National Preparedness Programs, John Brinkerhoff. A copy of the memo was obtained by the Herald. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, for example, helped draw up a controversial plan to suspend the Constitution in the event of a national crisis, such as nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or national opposition to a U.S. military invasion abroad. When the Attorney General at the time, William French Smith, learned of the proposal, he protested in writing to North's boss, then National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane. From 1982 to 1984, Oliver North assisted FEMA, the United States government's chief national crisis management unit, in revising contingency plans for dealing with nuclear war, insurrection, or massive military mobilization. Although the exact documents, including the more detailed plan and the memo, remain pretty much classified to this day, The Herald also seems to have come into possession of the written protest that Attorney General Smith wrote to the National Security Advisor after reviewing the plans himself. His reaction, detailed in this excerpt of his written protest, give us an idea of just how disturbing these plans must have been to read. Quoting again from the Miami Herald, "I believe that the role assigned to the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the revised executive order exceeds its proper function as a coordinating agency for emergency preparedness," Smith said in a letter to McFarland, which the Herald obtained. FEMA's clash with Smith occurred over a secret contingency plan that called for suspension of the Constitution, turning control of the United States over to FEMA, appointment of military commanders to run state and local governments, and declaration of martial law during a national crisis. The plan did not define national crisis, but it was understood to be nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or national opposition against a military invasion abroad. This reveal coincided with peak public interest in the Iran-Contra affair, and as a result, a brief attempt to question Oliver North on Rex 84, which is what this plan came to be called, was made during his congressional hearings on July 13th, 1987.
Were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster? Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir?
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution, and I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was, but I wanted to get his confirmation.
May I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
Well, we'll do that in another forum, I believe.
This was a shocking moment to everyone who had read the reporting done by the Miami Herald. More than anything, it proved that the reports were touching on factual, highly sensitive material. So sensitive, in fact, that Senator Daniel Inouye, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on the Iran-Contra affair, immediately stepped in to shut down Representative Brooks' question to prevent a public, televised leak of clearly sensitive national security information. The strangest part of Rex 84, in my opinion, is just how obscure and confidential the plan still is to this very day. From what we do know, it involved the discussion of completely removing the rights of all American citizens by abolishing the Constitution under the declaration of a, quote, national crisis. But little more elaboration for what this actually was has ever been given. Again, we have yet another horrifying example of something with huge implications that barely even made it in front of the public eye. It only broke through as a result of the sources who provided this information to the Miami Herald, and without them, it's likely that we never would have known about this operation. Zersetzung. Zersetzung, which literally translates to the English word decomposition, was East Germany's disturbing tool of silent psychological warfare against those who they perceived to be enemies of the state. It was developed in the late 1950s and formalized in January of 1976. It was sort of the beginning of a deliberate shift in East Germany from openly public arrests and physical authoritarian enforcement into more covert methods, yet unfortunately remaining every bit as brutal. Rather than imprisoning political dissidents within Germany, the Stasi secret police, or the Ministry for State Security, aimed to cripple these internal targets by eroding confidence in their own mental stability, their reputations, and their social ties. manipulating minute, almost inconsequential aspects of their daily life. As a result, victims could rarely prove state involvement. The ultimate goal was to destroy their mental health and lower their chances of opposing or attacking the state, ideologically or otherwise. The process began with East Germany's extensive intelligence gathering. Officers compiled detailed reports of citizens' psychologies, social lives, medical records, school reports, intercepted mail, wiretapped conversations, and their immense network of hundreds of thousands of informants who would deliver private information on targets to the Stasi. These informants were literally just ordinary citizens who had been coerced, bribed, or blackmailed into spying on their neighbors, colleagues, or even friends and family members. Targets were selected often preemptively without having even done anything wrong, for minor acts like wearing slightly unconventional clothing, expressing anti-violent views, or by applying to reunify with their families in West Germany. Zersetzung was defined almost exclusively by deniable harassment designed to exploit specific personal vulnerabilities. Agents would secretly enter homes to rearrange furniture, mess with alarm clocks, swap out household items for foreign ones, or leave minor traces of manipulation that induced paranoia without any obvious signs of break-in. They would even deflate car tires, call their workplaces with anonymous tips to sabotage promotions or spawn rumors. Some verifiable, others just plausible lies, all with the intention of isolating targets from their friends and colleagues. Families could be turned against one another, careers systematically and silently derailed through false reports to employers or schools, and relationships ruined through false evidence of infidelity. We've talked about gang stalking before on the channel, and this is basically an example of this actually happening to large numbers of people. The scariest part, though, is that this kind of harassment is in many ways indistinguishable to the victim or those around them from genuine schizophrenia or related mental instability. This, of course, turned everyday life into an invisible and incommunicable nightmare. Jürgen Fuchs, one of the most notorious targets of the program, described it as an assault on the human soul, a psychosocial crime that left people questioning their sanity. Breakdowns, paranoia, insomnia, and even suicides were not uncommon for those involved. Thousands endured these completely invisible operations between the 1970s and 1989. Stasi files seized after the fall of East Germany would reveal the inner workings of many of these campaigns, yet in the face of document destruction and the lack of specific laws against the crimes committed by the state, many instances officially went unproven. Of course, this only further solidified the harm to the victims, even years after Zersetzung concluded. In other words, the Stasi was just playing God and kind of poking people's lives, slowly driving them insane. They invisibly implanted themselves into people's subconscious minds, making themselves both impossible to deny, yet impossible to prove to other people. This gave the impression to victims that they were constantly surrounded in an invisible psychological prison. Q source. To be clear, whether you are Christian or not, I think this next section is absolutely a fascinating piece of history. This next piece is a huge aspect of how the Bible was created, and what it contains and what it doesn't. And unfortunately for those of us who want to study his words, none of the historical Jesus's immediate followers were actually the ones to write down what he said. Instead, after he was crucified, his teachings were only preserved through word of mouth for years before they finally started being written down. The letters from Paul were written some 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death. The book of Mark was only preserved in writing something like 35 to 45 years later, and Matthew was written some 40 to 60 years after his death. However, somewhere within this gap between the time of Jesus and the writings now found in the New Testament, scholars believe enormous amounts of information about Jesus, his teachings, and the things he did during his life were irretrievably lost. Scholars have long established that Mark was the earliest written gospel, and that the books of Matthew and Luke each used it as a source for many of their stories. We know this because many sections from Mark can be found essentially verbatim in the books of Matthew and Luke, and that's even kind of an understatement. In fact, something like 90% of the book of Mark can basically be found in Matthew. Matthew basically contains the entire thing. Similarly, about 50 to 60% of the book of Mark appears in Luke. This is one of the primary ways that we know it was one of the earliest written Gospels. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. This isn't the only overlap seen in Matthew and Luke's sources. They seem to share numerous traditions about Jesus that are not found in Mark. This overlap, which is simply too precise to be coincidental, and yet is not seen in the Book of Mark or in any other surviving writings from the time, led 19th century German scholars to propose the existence of another second source of information that has since been lost to time. They believed that this source of information, which contained in-depth records of Jesus' life and actions, has been lost, perhaps permanently. They named it Q from the German word Quell, which means source. Scholars speculate that this hypothetical Q source likely began as a set of oral traditions that were eventually written down and were possibly circulated to some extent within Christian circles. Professor John Kloppenborg, who has done extensive research in this field, estimates that Q may have taken written form as early as just a handful of years after Jesus' crucifixion, perhaps between the years 40 and 60. If true, this would mean it's possible that Q source was the oldest written record of Jesus' teachings and his life, and that we do not have access to it, outside of these overlapping areas in Matthew and Luke. Of course, though, no physical copies of the Q source survive, at least none as far as archaeology has uncovered. The Gates of Janus. In Manchester, England, in the early 1960s, a man named Ian Brady, an office worker, began a relationship with Mira Hindley, a typist he met at their shared place of work. Brady, in particular, was driven by a desire for power, control, and violence. His worldview was deeply nihilistic, stemming from an extreme interpretation of the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. He steadily imposed this outlook of the world onto Hindley, and before long, the couple was completely out of control. Together, they would commit 5 murders between July of 1963 and October of 1965, specifically targeting children and teenagers who they lured with offers of rides or other help. The crimes, which would come to be known as the Moors murders, involved depraved acts of torture. It was this sadistic rush that motivated them. There was no other goal. Before we get to the actual piece of forbidden knowledge associated with this case, we need to go over what actually happened during these murders. Most bodies were buried in shallow graves on the massive treeless expanse of Saddleworth Moor. 16-year-old Pauline Reed was coerced into a van on the 12th of July, 1963, while heading to a dance. They drove her to the moor before abusing, murdering, and burying her in the field. 4 months later, on the 23rd of November, 12-year-old John Kilbride vanished from Ashton Market after accepting a ride from the couple. A similar string of torture occurred before he was killed and buried on the site. Then, 7 months later, in June of 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett was abducted while en route to his grandmother's house, driven to a rest stop, assaulted, murdered, and buried. His body has never been found despite decades of searches, though it is suspected to have been buried on the moor with the others. Next, on December 26, 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey was lured away from a fairground to the couple's home in Hattersley, outside Manchester. This was the most publicized of the murders because of how absolutely messed up it was. Horrific, unspeakable things took place in that house. It was all recorded on a 16-minute reel-to-reel tape, which captured her screams and pleas, with the voices of both killers audible in the background. She was driven back to the moor and buried. The final victim, 17-year-old Edward Evans, was approached while waiting for a train at Manchester Central Railway Station on the 6th of October 1965. Brady invited him back to their house in Hattersley for drinks. Hindley was introduced as Brady's sister when she picked them up in the car, and once they had relaxed over wine, Brady, who had been grooming Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law David Smith to become a potential accomplice in their crimes, sent Hindley to fetch him. Hindley told Smith to wait outside for a flashing light signal from the window. When it came, he knocked on the door, was let in by Brady, and was left alone in the kitchen. Moments later, there was a sharp, high-pitched scream, followed by repeated cries, then Hindley shouting, "Dave, help him," prompting Smith to rush into the living room where he saw Evans lying on the couch, with Brady standing over him, repeatedly striking the left side of Evans' head with a hatchet in a series of clumsy blows that failed to kill him outright while Evans continued screaming. Smith, who was frozen in shock and fearing for his life, was ordered to help clean up the scene. Brady told him he would help dispose of the evidence on Saddleworth Moor the following night. Brady had deliberately arranged for Smith's presence to be carried out in this exact way, to both initiate him and to implicate him in the crime. However, this didn't pan out the way that Brady thought it would. He confessed everything to his wife, and at 6:10 a.m. called the police from a nearby call box. They arrived at the couple's home and discovered the body exactly where and how Smith described it. The two were arrested, and neither took another free step for the rest of their lives, each charged with 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Okay, that was a very long backstory. All of this is to say that while imprisoned at the high-security Ashworth Hospital, Brady wrote a book titled The Gates of Janus, Serial Killing and Its Analysis, published in the United States in 2001, 35 years after his conviction. At first, he tried to publish the book in the United Kingdom, but of course, given the sensitivity of the case in England, British publishers were extremely reluctant to platform Brady. As a result, it was only released in the United States. The book sits at roughly 480 pages. Somewhat unexpectedly, it doesn't really contain a confessional autobiography or direct account of the crimes he committed. Rather, it's more of an attempt at a philosophical and psychological dissection of serial murder as a whole. He deliberately avoids confessing to any of his own crimes despite having been convicted for so long, and instead uses serial murder as a vehicle for exposing what he perceived to be hypocrisies of the modern world and human character. Right from the beginning, he explains his belief that killers and criminals possess a clearer vision of the double standard of society than the conformist majority of humanity is capable. He argues that modern governments hypocritically commit even more murder by legalizing execution and war while condemning killers who commit individual cases of violence. Brady claims that most psychopaths are not confined to prisons, but thrive completely undetected in government and business, where they wield and exercise power without consequence. That most decent people are latent hypocrites who secretly envy and desire power. He posits that these common people, outsiders to true power, lack the courage to act on their own impulses, forced to rationalize their timid nature as moral superiority over those who are capable of doing so. The book portrays serial killing as an addictive pursuit of control and a liberation from repressive mediocrity. In the second half of the book, he analyzes other killers, such as Ted Bundy and Henry Lee Lucas, arguing that these perpetrators are forged by the repressive aspects of their environment and society, rather than being inherently born as evil people. The title of the book, The Gates of Janus, comes from Roman mythology. Janus is the two-faced god of doorways and transitions, and most notably and importantly, his gates are open during times of war and they are closed in times of peace. It seems that Brady deliberately chose this title and this image in order to push that it was some sort of an intellectual declaration of war on society, I guess. Specifically what he believed to have been the hypocritical norms of society. There are various interpretations of the book, with some people believing he actually has some good points. But in my opinion, from what we know about who he actually was and the way he carried out the murders, the way that he went about his crimes doesn't exactly read as some kind of dramatic, philosophical revolt against society as he seems to claim it was. Instead, it seems more like the guy was just a psychopath with a sadistic lust for violence and inflicting suffering on others. It seems to me that the very way he's trying to sort of retcon his own story and the stories of other serial killers as rebels against a corrupt society is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a manipulative psychopath. Might is right. In 1896, a book titled Might is Right, with the alternate title The Survival of the Fittest, was published in Chicago under the pseudonym of Ragnar Redbeard. Its author was almost certainly a man by the name of Arthur Desmond. We know almost nothing about the guy. This is literally the clearest photo Wikipedia was able to find of him to put on his page. What is known is that he became a political radical, poet, and newspaper editor in New Zealand who emerged in the 1880s as a loud advocate for labor, land reform, and anti-elitist politics. He wrote pieces attacking landlords, monopolists, and members of parliament before attempting to run for parliament himself in New Zealand in the 1884 and 1887 elections. His ideas were just too radical for them to grab hold. He viciously attacked politicians and wealthy elites in a way that made him seem like a loose cannon, culminating in his defeat both times. These defeats, combined with his increasingly confrontational rhetoric and controversial positions, pushed him further away from conventional politics and towards a more radical and literally anti-moral philosophy. He moved to Australia in 1892, but repeated charges of defamation and plagiarism forced him to turn his back on both countries, landing him in the United States by 1895. Somewhere around here, his philosophy began to morph into something quite dark. He began to adopt an extreme, sort of cutthroat form of social Darwinism, applying the idea of survival of the fittest to all areas of society, believing that the strong can, should, and will rise to the top, and that, in turn, the weak are destined to be crushed. In 1896, he published Might is Right, more or less his personal manifesto, under the pseudonym Ragnar Redbeard. The work is basically a complete assault on the concepts of compassion, grace, mercy, and, to an extent, even morality itself. I'm going to start from literally the very beginning lines of the book, just so you can see what I'm talking about. In this arid wilderness of steel and stone, I tip my voice that you may hear. To the east and to the west I beckon. To the north and to the south I show a sign, proclaiming death to the weakling, wealth to the strong. Open your eyes that you may hear, O men of mildewed minds, and listen to me, ye laborious millions. For I stand forth to challenge the wisdom of the world, to interrogate the laws of man and of God. I request reasons for your golden rule and ask the why and wherefore of your 10 commandments. Before none of your printed idols do I bend in acquiescence, and he who saith, "Thou shalt," to me, is my mortal foe. I demand proof over all things, and accept, with reservations, even that which is true. I dip my forefinger into the watery blood of your impotent mob redeemer, your divine democrat, your Hebrew madman, and write over his thorn-torn brow, the true prince of evil, the king of the slaves. Death, I say death to every lie. He goes on to declare that all codes of right and wrong are inventions of the weak, designed to stifle the ambitions of the powerful, arguing that might alone creates right. Mercy, equality, and the golden rule are, quote, crude and immoral inventions. He attacks democracy, Christianity, women, the poor, and races of humans which he believes to be genetically inferior. He consistently inverts peaceful Christian principles in favor of their violent counterparts. If a man smite you on one cheek, smash him on the other. The model man of our forefathers was Odin, a warlord, but our ideal man is a weeping, horsewhipped Jew. To solemnly proclaim that all men are created equal is as stupid and unscientific as to assert that all dogs, cattle, apes, and trees are created equal. Might was right when Caesar bled upon the stones of Rome, and it is right when weakling breeds are hunted down like game. The poor and lowly are a creeping pestilence. They are no innocent ones, and the downtrodden are the justly damned, sinners in a hell they've made. Communities of cowards and their descendants are rightfully plundered, taxed, and enslaved. He writes that the American Declaration of Independence was a mistake, that women and children are the outright property of the male provider, and that human nature itself is carnivorous. He points to history, claiming that the entirety of the human story is endless war for land, gold, women, and power, and that any attempt to civilize that is self-deception. Quote, the common herd instinctively feels that a good fighter possesses all the requisite virtues of good leadership, and leadership is exactly what they want. By conquest alone can an animal king be deposed, and his vanquisher is always his successor. As long as his sight, hearing, strength, and courage endures, he is absolute lord, judge, procreator-in-chief, but not one moment longer. The king is dead. Long live the king. Leo Tolstoy warned that the core message of this book, that right only comes from conquest and aggression, would deeply harm art and society if spread across the masses. As a result of this very common position, booksellers refused to stock it on their shelves. It has been called one of the most incendiary works ever printed. The Adamites. The Adamites were an early Christian sect reportedly active in North Africa during the 2nd through 4th centuries. They practiced ritual nudity and held the belief that they were regaining the innocence of Adam and Eve from early in Genesis before the fall of man. They believed that if the shame of nakedness was a consequence of original sin, then those who had been spiritually restored to a pre-fall state had no reason to feel that shame. To them, walking around without shame of their nakedness was an indication that their primordial innocence had been restored. The primary historical evidence for the existence of the Adamites comes from early Christian writers who were documenting and studying heresies. However, none of their own written works, if any ever existed, have survived, meaning our only knowledge of them comes filtered through these hostile secondary sources. From what has survived, it seems that members conducted worship services in the nude and reportedly addressed one another as Adam and Eve, emphasizing their belief that their community represented a restored paradise where the effects of sin had been abolished. They simply called their church Paradise and condemned marriage as foreign to Eden. The accounts we do have on the Adamites seem to contradict each other, making it kind of hard to say exactly what their beliefs were rooted in, as well as whether they condemned sexual taboos or welcomed them, believing that they were nullified due to their innocence. Some theologians at the time considered the Adamites to be associated with sensual mysticism, openly welcoming sexuality. However, others portrayed them as extreme ascetics who had the goal of overcoming these sinful desires entirely through strict discipline. These seem to be polar opposites, so again, it's kind of hard to say exactly what they believed in and practiced. Knowing human nature, it's possible that they attempted to live these ascetic lifestyles at first, ultimately failed due to the fact that they had, in fact, probably not restored themselves to the pre-fallen state of man, and perhaps after that took the more laissez-faire approach to sexuality, but of course that's just speculation.